Hello, my name is Armin Briegel. I run the weblog Scripting OS 10. I also work as a consultant for Pro Warehouse, a Dutch Apple-authorized enterprise reseller and Jamf Gold reseller. Today, I would like to talk about some best practices when scripting Jamf. There are many ways where you can use scripts in Jamf to automate workflows and to influence the entire deployment and management workflow. The most obvious one is, of course, Jamf policy scripts, which can be triggered in all kinds of different times during enrollment, at regular intervals, login, restart, all of these that can have behavior on how the machine works. We also have extension attributes, which are mini scripts that gather information on the client and put it into the Jamf database. Installation packages, PKGs, will have installation scripts that run either before or after the installation and can have custom logic inside them. Of course, third-party packages that you might use might have installation scripts that you don't really have control over. We can use launch daemons and agents to further modify behavior on the client at certain times. And third-party applications might have hooks and events or user-initiated application scripts that also extend the behavior. And then finally, there's terminal, which we can use to manually invoke scripts for our own workflows at Mac admins or to give to pro users as ways of extending their workflows and automating their workflows. This is, of course, a huge topic, and we could talk for hours and hours about that. Today I want to talk about these three things. The first one is how the environment in which a script is running will affect its behavior, for the good or worse. How running the script as different users will affect their behavior. And how the privacy controls in macOS going forward from Mojave will affect your scripts, especially with AppleScript events. I have a website on my site, scriptingos10.com/JNUC2020, where there will be links to deeper articles and more information, and also some of the code examples I have in here. This is where it always starts. You write a script, it works when testing, and then when you want to deploy it from Jamf or as a package installer script, it stops working. And you're like, why? I don't understand. And you often see people go to MacAdmin Slack or Jamf Nation or some other forum, and they're like, it works. I run it from terminal. I tried from Jamf, and it's broken. What can I do? As I said earlier, each shell that interprets your script has its own environment. And when you launch something from terminal, each terminal window gets its own instance of the shell with its own environment. The environment consists of environment variables, some of which influence the behavior of the shell, like the path or the current working directory. Others have other information, like the current user's home directory, or just arbitrary information that you can add to the environment or third-party software might add to the environment. There are shell options, which are settings that influence the behavior of the shell and might enable compatibility or disable certain features. And then finally, there are aliases and functions, which are kind of like macros in the terminal environment, but can also extend the behavior and the functionality of the shell. When you're running in terminal, all of this environment is built from configuration in the terminal application, information the terminal application hands over to the shell, but also from the shell configuration files that you might have built, that you might be using, or that third-party apps might have configured for you, like the bash profile, bashrc, or zshrc, depending on which shell you are using. Your script runs within this environment and inherits this environment, and it gets all the data from that environment. So when I run something from terminal, I will have a certain environment and certain data that I can use in my scripts. But when I run the same script from within Jamf as a Jamf policy or as an installation script from within installer, the environment will be set up differently. The shell will have a different environment, will have much less information it gets because it's not running within terminal, and data may be missing, and that might lead to your script failing in this context. The most common reason for this are environment variables. So user, home, shell, these are variables that are actually passed on to the shell by terminal to give them its context, to give the terminal its context, which will be entirely missing when you're running it from Jamf or as an installation script. In general, if something is in all caps, it's probably dangerous. The most common problem here is the path environment variable. The path environment variable is used by the shell to determine where the file for a given terminal command actually resides. So if you enter a network setup in your terminal, the shell will take the path variable, split it at the colon, it's a colon separated list, and walk through these folders to look for an executable file that is called network setup. It will look in USR local bin, it will look in USR bin, it won't find it there, neither will it find it in just /bin, but then finally in USR sbin we will find an executable called network setup, and that is what your shell will be using. Now, depending on the context we're running in, the default path will be different. The default path in terminal on macOS, we've seen already, it's USR local bin and then 4 main folders. But in your terminal, it will probably be different because you might have changed its configuration in your bash profile or ZSHRC file. Third-party applications might have added to the default path. So this is the minimum default path. Yours will probably look different. When you execute a script from a Jamf policy, then you will have a different path. It adds the USR local bin at the end, and then also the folder to the Jamf binaries. When you run from installation scripts, you have yet another default path. And when you run from within applications, say you run from an AppleScript with do shell script, you have yet another path. There are 4 folders that are common to all of these paths. They are kind of the universal path folders. This is where the system command line tools reside. The command line tools that come from macOS, and they actually come from the Darwin core of macOS. And these are kind of like the minimum that you need and that you can rely on. We can rely on these commands because these folders are protected by system integrity protection, and on Catalina and higher the read-only system volume. So these are a good basis. These should be your minimum, and these are the minimum in all of the defaults. But there's one that is fairly common to use when you're in the interactive terminal, but that is probably not in that list from all the other sources, and that's USR local bin. The point being, the USR local bin folder is not protected. It is meant to be a place where admin users and third-party tools can add functionality to the terminal. But because of that, it might be unreliable for management. There might be tools in there that you not expect. They might be the tools that you expect there might have been overwritten. So you probably don't want USR local bin in your path in your scripts. But if you do, you want it at the end where it doesn't override the system tools. One solution around this uncertainty about the path is to always use the full path to a command. We often see this in admin scripts. It works. It is a good solution. Then I can be certain that I am using the system's DF and not something that might be overridden, or I get an error because the command cannot be found. If you're uncertain where the binary actually resides, you can use the which command, which, and then the command, and it will show you where the executable for that command actually resides that you can use in the script. The downsides to this is that there is much more code you have to type. There's also much more code you have to read. I think it makes the script very hard to read. And you have to remember it. Some commands you will remember very quickly, but if you have a memory like me, then many of the commands will just go away as soon as you type them, and you have to keep looking them up all the time. There is a slight risk that you might override built-ins that you shouldn't override, that don't need the full path, and that might slightly change their functionality, or drastically in some cases if you're using Z shell scripts. That is a minor danger. I think the illegibility is the major downside. A better way of creating an environment that you can be certain about is to actually create that environment at the beginning of your script. So in the case of the path variable, I always set as the first line, right after the shebang in my script, the path that I plan to use in the script. And this is usually the default path that we've seen before, but if I know I'm going to use the Jamf binary, well, then I can add the Jamf binary to the path that I'm going to use in my script, and then I can use the Jamf binary in later on. You can mix and match these two approaches. If there's a single command in a special location, like the airport tool, that you want to use, you can use a full path in one case, and then the path environment variable for all other normal commands. What about the other environment variables, like the current user? The current user in macOS means something else than the user variable in the shell, even though it's probably not set when you're running from Jamf. What we usually want is the user who is currently logged in using the interactive console or interface. And Ben Toms published this command years ago that gives me that information in even weird edge cases with fast user switching and so on. It is based on a Python call into the system frameworks, which gives me a very realistic view of the system, but we know in the future Python will go away as a built-in tool in macOS, so we needed to find a different solution. And Eric Berglund found a solution that is based on the scutil command, which goes into the same framework as the aforementioned Python command. It is much shorter to read and clearer as well, and gives me the same result. So this is what people should be using going forward. If you want the user's home directory to affect their files, then you can make probably a safe assumption in most cases that the user's home directory is in users/their short name. There might be edge cases and situations where that isn't the case, and you know your deployments better than anybody else, so you can be the judge of that. You can directly read the actual home directory for a user with the discal command. It's the NFS home directory attribute, and that will give me the user's home directory no matter where it resides. Talking about users, scripts also inherit the user they're running as from the surrounding environment. So if I launch a script from terminal, terminal is running as me, my user, the shell is running as my user, and my script will be running as my user as well, and then, you know, all will be fine. But if I launch the same script from Jamf or an installation script, it will actually be running as root, which is usually a good thing for management scripts, but it also affects the behavior and what it can access. Now, in most cases, we will actually have the case that the script will run fine as root, but won't run when I launch it from terminal, but it might go either way. And there are processes and actions that I might need to do from Mac admin scripts that require to be run as the user and not as root. Usually these are commands that interact with user space, with user processes, applications, or user settings. So, for example, the defaults command sets a preference for the current user. When I run that from a Jamf script as root, then I will be setting root's preferences. So I will be writing this preference to set the dock to the left side, which is where it belongs in my opinion, to var root library preferences com appledoc plist, which is probably not what you were intending to do. What you were intending to do was to set this preference for the current user. And you can run the defaults command as the current user. We learned earlier how to determine the current user, and we can use that here in combination with sudo-u current user, and then my command will run this command in the user space instead of as root. And then it will change the preference in users armin library preferences com appledoc plist, which is probably what you intended. There is one exception to this. When you affect launch agents run as the current user. You can't use sudo, you have to use launchctl as user, and that takes the numeric user ID as the argument. For me, this got a bit tedious to remember, even though it's fairly straightforward. The good news is you can be safe and just use both. It doesn't hurt to use launchctl as user and then sudo-u. That will work in all cases, but this is a lot to type or to read, which again makes your script illegible. So I put all of this into a shell function. Run as user, it does some sanity checks, and determines the numerical user ID, and then it runs the arguments that I pass into this function with both launchctl and sudo. So in my script, if I take this function and put it at the beginning, I can use run as user launchctl load, or I can use run as user defaults, right, and not worry about the underlying thing, not have to think about that while I'm writing the script, actually do what I need to do. Can use it with open. Open is another example for user interaction. This will open a great weblog in the default browser. I can use it with OSAScript. OSAScript stands for Open Scripting Architecture, which is the underlying framework for AppleScript. So this will run this single AppleScript command, display dialog, and I will get a dialog for the user, which is sometimes very useful to have. Now, talking about AppleScript and OSAScript, these usually need to run as the user. There are exceptions. Sometimes it will work if you're running it as root, but I don't rely on that. I just, for safety, run all OSAScript invocations as the user. Otherwise, you might change your script slightly in the future and suddenly it breaks for some weird reason. The reason AppleScript needs to run as the user is that AppleScript usually talks with other processes or the user interface or other things that are owned by the user, and macOS has some protections that will block root run processes from communicating directly with them. I've already shown display dialog, user interaction. AppleScript has a few nice shortcut commands there that we can invoke from a shell script. It's otherwise very hard to get user interaction from a shell script. These need to run as the user. There are two ways of syntax. We saw the -e one, which gives a single line, and the other one is the here doc, which is the two less than signs and then a label. And then everything in my shell script that comes until that label is repeated will be sent into OSAScript and executed by OSAScript. So this is my AppleScript within my shell script. You can combine this with command substitution. So if you want the output of your AppleScript, in this case, the text returned of a display dialog where you enter your username, I can put that into a bash variable, which is very useful. In this case, you just have to pay attention. The closing parenthesis of my command substitution has to be on a line of its own, because the closing label of the here document has to stand alone. Otherwise, bash does weird things and won't find it. I can use bash variable substitution or shell variable substitution in my here document. So in this case, I get the value of a shell variable into my AppleScript before it is piped into OSAScript. But that's nice, so my default answer can be populated by the current user instead of a fixed value. Of course, the strength of AppleScript is that I can send events to a different application, get information from a different application. So in this case, I'm asking Finder, what's the current desktop picture? And in this case, you will get the dreaded privacy warning in Mojave and higher, because talking with other processes since then is a privacy problem, privacy challenge, and the user has to approve this. Now for management scripts, we want to avoid these dialogues because they interrupt the script, they fail the script, and they give the user this weird dialogue which they don't know what to do with. When you do it manually, we do that in the privacy preference pane, but that obviously doesn't really scale. But in this case, I will find either terminal application or the script that I wrote will get the exemption to talk with Finder in the automation pane. The good news is that not all AppleScripts require approval. Only AppleScripts that send events to other processes require approval. So the tell application block that goes to a different event, that is what triggers the privacy dialog. And in many cases, in older scripts, you will find tell application blocks that are unnecessary. They used to be put there because there were problems with macOS with the dialogues being somewhere in the background instead of in the front where the user sees them. But these aren't necessary anymore in macOS. That problem went away years ago. So instead of sending my display dialog command to the system events application, which is unnecessary, I can just drop the tell application block and write display dialog. And this will not trigger a privacy dialog instead of the tell application block, which does. Mount volume is another example that doesn't need to be in a tell application finder. You often see mount volume in the tell application finder. Doesn't have to be. In general, the user interaction, AppleScript commands, clipboard, volume control, mount volume, anything you find in the standard editions library in the dictionary list of script editor will not need a tell block. And that covers a lot of the functionality that we use AppleScript for as Mac admins, especially the user interaction part. Even when you are sending events to a different process, there are some that don't require approval. Activate is one that either opens an application or brings it to the front. Open, which opens documents, open location, which opens URLs, and quit, which ends a process. Neither of these will trigger a privacy dialog. These are exempt from the limitations. So if I want to open a great weblog site in Google Chrome instead of just the default browser, then I could use this script in my shell script to do that, and it would not require a privacy exemption. However, if you use a command that is not one of these 4 exempt commands, then you will get the privacy. So this will just ask the Finder for the current desktop picture. That will, no, this will set the current desktop picture. That will trigger a privacy exemption. And this is a command that I had been using for years to set the current desktop picture, but allow the user to change it later. And then in Mojave, I started running into these privacy dialogues. And instead of messing with the profiles, I wanted to find a different solution. And I found that if I used the Cocoa libraries to set the desktop picture, I wouldn't get the privacy dialogues. So I wrote a small tool called Desktopper, which I can use to set the desktop, which doesn't trigger them. So the ways to avoid the privacy prompts is to determine if the tell block is really, really necessary and remove it if it isn't. Maybe I can use one of the exempt Apple events, then I'm safe. Or maybe there is an alternative solution that is not based on AppleScript that somebody found or wrote, and I can use that, like in the case of Desktopper. All of that said, there will still be situations where I simply have to send events to other processes. You want to configure Outlook, or in this case, I want to remove a login item. I can set login items with a configuration profile, but I can't remove them. I need to use this Apple event for that. In this case, I have to build an approval profile, and you've probably done that. The best tool for building them is the PPPC utility, Profile Creator, or the iMazing Profile tool can also be used for this. And upload it to your MDM, and which will then push it down to your clients and give certain processes pre-approval. In this case, I'm giving my desktop picture script app the permission to talk with Finder. In general, you need to find the parent app of the process. You don't have to accept your script. You have to accept the parent process. When you're running in terminal, the parent process is the terminal app. But when you're running something from a Jamf policy, it might be one of the Jamf binary, the Jamf agent binary, or the Jamf app that is on your system. And Jamf creates a default policy that allows full disk access for these 3 processes and pushes it automatically to all your clients. But if you need more exemptions for your script, especially Apple events, you need to create those and add those yourself. And you can do that on top of the default policy that Jamf creates. Installer packages, you may run into privacy dialogues from installer packages. You may run into privacy dialogues from installer packages from third-party vendors, which is really sad. I would resist the temptation to try to exempt installer packages or the installer process for certain price, because then you grant it to every package that is out there. And also your package might run in other context where you might not even be able to grant that exception already. So pre and post install scripts and installer packages, if you run into privacy problems, privacy dialogues, you're doing it wrong. You're holding it wrong. and you should avoid doing that in general. If you customize the behavior of the clients with launch daemons or launch agents, you might run into privacy access problems, and then you need to exempt the script and binary itself. But before you can do that, you need to code sign the script or binary that you're launching from launch daemon, and then you can add it to a PPPC profile. This is how it would look like if I were to exempt a Jamf policy to send a event to system events, like for the delete login example that I had earlier. And to be safe with Jamf, you should always have the two binaries in the application. If you're really uncertain which exemption you need, which Apple event or which of the other exemptions that you can give in the privacy preference pane, and sometimes that can be very confusing which one is being triggered, you can use this log command, which will spew out a lot of information, but among that will be the information which process is asking for the permission to do something. You do that before you provoke the dialog, and then you will get the information in the log, among many other information. So to finish, we talked about the shell environment, we talked about users, and we talked about the PPPC, privacy protections, and scripts. The way to work around all the different environments is to control your environment. Instead of just assuming the environment exists, make sure you set the environment like the path variable in your script before you use it. Get the current user, get the home directory. Don't think it's already done by you by some magic shell process. You need to know when a process needs to run as user, when it needs to interact with user process or user data, or as root when we need management processes, and which of the ways of launching something runs as user or as root. You want to avoid the privacy approval dialogues with Apple events in particular when possible, and there are some ways where we can actively avoid them and still get our functionality. But then when that doesn't work, we need to build the PPPC profile when it's absolutely necessary. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I did preparing it. As I said earlier, you can find more information and many links on my website at scriptingos10.com/JNUC2020. And now I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you, and I hope to see you all soon.